The issue of sweatshops has existed and been relevant since major companies started growing and expanding, which has mainly been in the past 30 to 40 years. The usual argument is that sweatshops in developing countries such as China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Thailand contain unworkable conditions and wages that cannot provide for a decent life. However, what many people don't focus on is what's necessary about sweatshops and why they're kind of needed to satisfy the global economy, and our economy would fall without them. Sweatshops are not only beneficial to the countries' economies that sell the items, for example the economy of the United States, because they sell a lot of the items there. They're also beneficial to the developing countries that contain those sweatshops. Not to mention, sweatshops also benefit the workers, and I know this can be a controversial claim about how they're beneficial to the workers and like how they affect the workers, but I'll get back to that later. Okay, so sweatshops increase employment rate, and they provide safer alternatives, and even though the wage is not that high, it's usually better than the average. And these points prove why sweatshops are justifiable and they're needed to satisfy the global economy, and humans need them. Okay, next slide. Wait. What? Oops. Sorry. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the idea that sweatshops provide a minimum wage that cannot provide a decent life for these people has kind of spread globally. And people have started many anti-sweatshop movements and this causes many people to wonder, why don't they just increase sweatshop wages? Why don't governments just increase the wages in sweatshops? And this brings me to my next slide. Why not increase wage? They believe if the government allows for higher wages, workers will be happier. But increases in wage can actually force the government to fire many workers. So this is usually sacrificing one thing for the other, sacrificing how many workers there are for higher wages, or sacrificing the higher wages for more people getting employed. So there's both negatives and positives when it comes to this. And this also works the same for companies. For example, Nike received backlash after they had to fire workers in Hansei to keep decent wages. And additionally, in Honduras, Nike was forced to shut down their Star factory, which is one of their main factories. And people started to realize, like, oh, this is resulting in over 400, 500 workers not having a job anymore. Now there's 500 people in that area without a job. So Nike got the factory back, and those workers got their jobs back, and now are back making money for their families, just making monies, and they finally have jobs. So overall, wages are improving, and this brings me to my next point. How do sweatshops compare to the average incomes in countries? Okay. Focus on the chart for a little bit. Okay. This chart shows the apparel industry for most big companies, their workers, as a percentage of national income. In almost every country here, you see, working at least 40 hours in each location earns you probably about more than 150% the national income, except in places like Bangladesh and Indonesia. And you can see in places like Haiti, Honduras, and Nicaragua, working only 40 hours a week can earn you more than 300, 400% the national income in those countries. Okay. Another study recorded by the Adam Smith Institute found that workers in Haiti, Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Nicaragua that I mentioned earlier earn 3 to up to 7 times the national average for sweatshop workers. Like in Honduras, sweatshop workers earn $13 US per day, yet 44% of the population there lives on less than $2 a day. So in Honduras, sweatshop working is actually a pretty good job. The idea that sweatshops provide a minimum wage has been kind of over-exaggerated, excluding Bangladesh, Indonesia, and India, but I'll get to that later. Okay. Next, we have employment. Sweatshops have a huge impact on employment. With sweatshops, people living in overpopulated countries, or these developing countries, finally have a job and are making money. Overall, sweatshops increase the employment rates and help people actually get jobs. And a study here, that was the answer to that question. Answers the second question about their effect on women. There's been many claims that sweatshops have a bad effect on women. There's been abuse towards women, and that is true. But on the positive side, Yale and the University of Washington conducted a study to see how helpful sweatshops were to women. And they found that girls are actually less likely to get pregnant or married off when working in sweatshops. And school enrollment has increased by 40%. Now, their effect on poverty. Okay, as you can see by this graph, Bangladesh is known for sweatshops, but one plus is their employment. Right? So this chart shows how the percentage of the population that has been in poverty from around the 1990s to basically current day. And as sweatshops have increased, poverty in Bangladesh has improved too. For example, if you can see from here, urban poverty has decreased from 45% to 21%. National poverty has dropped from 59% to 31%, and rural poverty has dropped from 61% to 35%. And not to mention, 4,500 factories in Bangladesh employ 4 million workers. So without those 4,500 factories, that would mean millions of workers out of job. And they'd not be able to make money for their families, not be able to make anything, not be able to provide at all. So without sweatshops, millions would be unemployed and not be able to provide for their family. Okay, now this brings me to alternatives. You see? Okay, the alternatives to sweatshop jobs are actually not that good. In Vietnam, 59% of workers are farmers. And subsistence farming can be a really kind of dangerous and risky occupation since there's no steady wage and it's kind of inconsistent in terms of success. In Bangladesh, 77% of the population lives on less than $2 a day, yet sweatshop workers average just above $2 a day. Not saying that's great because $2 a day is kind of really bad, but it just shows how sweatshop working in that country is kind of better than the other alternatives. And as I mentioned earlier, in places like Honduras, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic, sweatshop working can earn up to 7 times the national average. So overall, alternatives to sweatshops are not that good, and even though sweatshops are shown in a bad light sometimes, if you compare them to some of the other alternatives in those developing countries, they actually seem pretty good. Okay. And I answered those questions already. Now on to the negatives. Okay, so many argue that sweatshops contain conditions that people cannot work in and wages that cannot provide for a decent life. And even though this is over-exaggerated and it's kind of a single story, honestly, it is true. A photographer from Europe named Casillas traveled to Bangladesh to take photos within the sweatshops to see the conditions, just to see how they're going, and this is one of the photos he took. And according to Casillas, the workers within sweatshops he looked at work from 6 to 6.5 days per week, and the workers move into the city kind of to seek for a better life, but they don't really get it. And in a normal factory, he said that it contains around 15 sewing machines, and there are no emergency exits and no fire escape plans, so as you can see, it's pretty dangerous. And as you can see, many of these workers are actually children. So instead of getting an education, maybe, they're just working 6 to 6.5 days per week in a factory. And additionally, people have died within sweatshops. In 2016, a Gap worker was electrocuted. He died. And in 2013, Rana Plaza collapsed, which is one of the well-known sweatshops, killing 1,134 people and injuring over 2,500 people. And this kind of began, after that happened, it kind of began a bunch of anti-sweatshop movements and a bunch of protests. And this is when sweatshops kind of became an issue again. And yeah, so those are the negatives. I didn't want to say there's only positive when it comes to sweatshops. Of course, there's a lot of negatives too. There's a lot of room for improvement, even though I still think sweatshops are justifiable. Okay, brings me back to my claim. Sweatshops can be detrimental, yet are kind of necessary for keeping the economy going, kind of necessary to the human race. Similar to something like planes, for example, or maybe cars, even though kind of bad for the environment, they're essential to the world and are crucial to humans. Sorry. Okay. The issue of sweatshops has been greatly improved, and it's not fair to say that there are only negatives when it comes to sweatshops, but it's also not fair to say that there are only positive when it comes to sweatshops, because there's still a lot of room for improvement, and especially in places like Bangladesh, India, and Indonesia. As you can see from the chart earlier, working 70 hours a week only reaches a little bit above the national income, which is pretty bad for those standards. Yet, overall, considering alternatives, considering wage, and considering employment, sweatshops are justifiable and are necessary for the economy and the human race. Thank you.